My mother said it the way she said most things that landed like a blade, casually, almost as an afterthought, sandwiched between a comment about the weather and a question about whether I'd remembered to renew my car insurance. "Well, your sister was always the good daughter," she said. "You know that." I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, engine still running, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something in my chest go very quiet and very still. Then, before I hung up, I said the one thing I had spent 36 years never quite allowing myself to say out loud. Part 1, the ledger my mother kept. My name is Vanessa, and I was 36 years old in September 2024, sitting in that parking lot in Sacramento, when a decade's worth of quietly accumulated resentment finally found a single sentence sharp enough to cut through it. I need to explain the specific shape of the ledger my mother, Linda, had been keeping for most of my adult life, because the comment that triggered everything didn't come from nowhere. It came from a pattern established with remarkable consistency since I was roughly 19 years old, the year my younger sister, Claire, married her college boyfriend, Todd, and moved 45 minutes from my parents' house in Fresno, while I left for graduate school in Boston. A decision my mother had never fully forgiven me for, even 14 years later. Claire, in my mother's accounting, had done everything correctly. She'd married young in 2011, given my parents their first grandchild in 2013, settled close enough to visit every Sunday, and built a life that unfolded, from my mother's perspective, exactly according to a script she'd apparently written for both of us long before either of us had any say in the matter. I, meanwhile, had built a career as an environmental policy consultant, a path that took me first to Boston for my master's degree, then to Washington, D.C. for 8 years working on federal water policy, before I eventually settled in Sacramento in 2019, drawn by a state-level position focused on drought resilience planning. Work I found genuinely meaningful, work that had, by 2024, made me a recognized expert in my specific field. Work my mother had described, more than once, at family gatherings, as Vanessa's little research thing, in a tone that made clear she considered it, at best, an interesting hobby rather than the actual substance of a life. I had never married. I'd been in a serious relationship for the past 6 years with a man named Derek, a relationship we'd both, quite deliberately, decided not to formalize through marriage, having discussed it thoroughly and concluded together that the legal and ceremonial structure of marriage simply wasn't something either of us needed to validate a partnership we already considered permanent. I did not have children, a choice I had made consciously, and, for the most part, happily, though it remained, without question, the single detail of my adult life my mother returned to most frequently and most pointedly. Part 2, 36 years of small comparisons. I want to be precise about the specific texture of what I'd absorbed over the years, because I think it matters for understanding why one particular sentence, on one particular Tuesday, finally broke something that had been slowly cracking for over a decade. The comparisons had never been dramatic or explosive. They arrived in small, almost innocuous packages. A comment at Christmas about how nice it was that Claire's children would carry on the family, delivered while I was standing right there. A remark at my father's 60th birthday party in 2021 about how Claire had really stepped up to help organize the event, followed immediately by a pointed observation that I'd only been able to swing by for a few hours, given my work schedule, despite the fact that I'd flown across the country specifically for the occasion and stayed for 4 full days. A running commentary, sustained across years of phone calls, about various friends' and cousins' weddings and baby showers, always circling back, eventually, to some version of the same question. When would I be settling down the way Claire had? I had absorbed all of this for years with a kind of practiced, exhausted patience, telling myself that my mother's generation simply understood a woman's worth through a narrower lens than I did, that her comments came from genuine care, filtered through limited imagination, rather than actual cruelty, that engaging directly would only produce more conflict than the comments themselves were worth. But something had been quietly, steadily accumulating beneath that patience, a ledger of my own, tracking every small comparison, every subtle diminishment, every moment my mother had made clear, in ways large and small, that my sister's more conventional life represented the real accomplishment, while my own considerably harder one, deliberately chosen path represented, at best, an interesting deviation from what actually mattered. Part 3, the specific phone call. The call that finally cracked everything open began, like most of our calls, with entirely ordinary conversation. My mother had called to ask about a family gathering planned for the upcoming Thanksgiving, wanting to confirm whether I'd be flying home. A conversation that unfolded easily enough until she mentioned, almost as an aside, that Claire had recently been promoted to office manager at the dental practice, where she'd worked part-time for the past several years. "That's wonderful," I said, genuinely meaning it. I had always liked Claire, and our relationship, whatever complicated dynamics existed with our mother, had remained genuinely warm across the years, largely because Claire herself had never participated in our mother's comparisons, had in fact occasionally pushed back on them gently when she witnessed them directly. "It really is," my mother said. "She's worked so hard, balancing that with the kids and everything Todd needs. I don't know how she manages it all, honestly. She's always been the one who just handles things, takes care of everyone." There was a pause, and then, in the specific tone I'd cataloged over years as the preamble to a comparison, she added, "Well, your sister was always the good daughter. You know that." I sat in that grocery store parking lot, engine running, feeling the entire accumulated weight of 36 years pressed down into a single, crystallizing moment of clarity. Part 4, what I actually said. I want to walk through exactly what I said next, because I think the precision of it matters. This wasn't an explosion of pent-up rage, though rage had certainly been part of what was building for years. It was, instead, something calmer and, in its own way, considerably more devastating, because it was entirely, deliberately true. "Mom," I said, "I need you to actually hear what you just said. Because I don't think you fully understand how many times you've said some version of that exact sentence to me over the years." "Vanessa, I didn't mean." "Let me finish," I said, and something in my voice must have carried enough weight that she actually stopped talking, which was, itself, a fairly rare occurrence in our calls. "You've spent my entire adult life describing Claire as the good daughter. Not a good daughter, the good daughter. As if there's only room in this family for one of us to actually be good. And you decided, sometime around when I left for graduate school 14 years ago, that the role had already been permanently assigned, and nothing I've done since has ever been enough to earn even partial credit toward it." "That's not fair," my mother said, her voice tightening. "I'm proud of both of you." "I don't think that's true," I said, and I want to be honest that saying this specific sentence out loud, after years of carefully avoiding it, felt like something physically shifting in my chest. "I think you're genuinely, uncomplicatedly proud of Claire, and I think you find my life mildly disappointing, in ways you've never quite been able to say directly, so instead you say things like, 'Your sister was always the good daughter,' which accomplishes the same thing without you ever having to take responsibility for how it actually lands." Part 5, the rest of that difficult conversation. My mother, to her credit, did not immediately hang up or dismiss what I'd said, though her initial response leaned heavily toward defensive denial rather than genuine engagement. "I don't understand where this is coming from," she said. "I've never once said I wasn't proud of your career. You've done remarkable things, Vanessa. Everyone in the family talks about how impressive your work is." "Talking about my work being impressive isn't the same as treating my life as equally valid to Claire's," I said. "You've spent years measuring both of us against a specific, narrow definition of what a successful daughter's life looks like. Marriage, children, proximity, the specific kind of caretaking Claire provides that fits neatly into your idea of what family devotion means. My version of devotion looks different. It's flying across the country for your birthday, even though my job is demanding. It's calling every single week, even from a different time zone. It's genuinely, deeply caring about this family while also building a life that doesn't match the specific script you'd apparently written for both of us before either of us had any say in it." I never asked you to give up your career, my mother said, her voice carrying real hurt now, a hurt that I recognized, even in that moment, as probably genuine rather than performed. I've never once told you to quit your job and move home. You didn't have to say it directly, I said. You said it in 100 smaller ways instead. Every comment about Claire handling things while I'm off doing my little research thing. Every remark about how nice it must be that Claire's kids will carry on the family, while conspicuously not mentioning anything I might be building instead. You built an entire framework where Claire's choices count as real contribution and mine count as an interesting tangent. And I've spent over a decade absorbing that framework without ever telling you how much it actually cost me. Part 6, the silence and what came after. There was a long silence on the line after that, long enough that I genuinely wondered, for a moment, whether the call had dropped entirely. I don't know what to say, my mother said finally, her voice smaller than I'd heard it in years. I don't think I've ever thought about it the way you're describing it. I thought I was just acknowledging how hard Claire works, being close by, helping with everything. I didn't realize it was landing as a comparison every single time. It was, I said, almost every time for years. We talked for nearly another hour that afternoon, longer than any single phone call we'd had in recent memory, working through specific examples, specific moments I'd carried for years without ever mentioning them, watching my mother's understanding shift, gradually, and with visible difficulty, from defensive denial toward something closer to genuine, uncomfortable recognition of a pattern she'd apparently never consciously examined. I did not hang up on her in the end, despite how the earlier tension in the conversation might have suggested that outcome. But I did end the call, eventually, with a clear, direct request rather than the usual polite, unresolved ending our calls typically carried. I need you to actually think about this, I told her. Not just apologize in the moment and then fall back into the same patterns next month. I need you to actually examine why you've built such a narrow definition of what counts as being a good daughter, and whether that definition has room for the specific way I've chosen to live my life. Part 7, the months that followed. I want to be honest that the months following that phone call did not produce an instant, complete transformation in my mother's behavior. Old patterns, especially ones built across decades, rarely dissolve in the space of a single difficult conversation, however clarifying that conversation might feel in the moment. But something did genuinely shift, gradually, over the following months. My mother, to her credit, made visible, if imperfect, efforts to catch herself in the specific comparative language she'd relied on for years. During our Thanksgiving gathering that November, I noticed her, on at least 2 separate occasions, beginning a sentence that seemed headed toward a familiar comparison, then visibly redirecting mid-thought toward something more neutral or more specifically appreciative of my own life, rather than measured against Claire's. She also, during a phone call in December, brought up our earlier conversation directly, unprompted, in a way that suggested she'd genuinely been sitting with it in the intervening months. I've been thinking about what you said, she told me, about the good daughter thing. I talked to your Aunt Patricia about it, actually, and she pointed out that I probably learned that specific way of measuring daughters from my own mother, who absolutely did the same thing between me and your Aunt Patricia, growing up. I think I just never noticed I was repeating a pattern I'd resented myself when I was your age, sitting on the other side of it. That admission mattered enormously to me, not because it excused the years of comparison I'd absorbed, but because it represented genuine, difficult self-examination rather than a quick, hollow apology offered simply to end an uncomfortable conversation. Part 8, Claire's perspective. I want to include, here, a conversation I had with Claire herself, a few weeks after the initial phone call with our mother. Because I think it adds an important dimension to this story that's easy to overlook when focusing primarily on the mother-daughter dynamic between Linda and me. Claire, when I told her what had happened, reacted with a complicated mixture of validation and her own, previously unspoken frustration. I'm glad you finally said something, she told me, during a call that turned into one of the more honest conversations we'd had in years. Vanessa, I need you to know being the good daughter in Mom's specific framework has never felt like an unambiguous compliment to me either. It's meant my whole adult life that I'm expected to be endlessly available, endlessly accommodating, the one who handles every family crisis and every holiday logistics nightmare, because that's apparently what good means in Mom's accounting. I've watched you build this incredible, independent career, make deliberate choices about your own life on your own terms, and there have absolutely been moments I've envied that, even while Mom was busy holding you up as the cautionary comparison rather than the aspiration. This conversation reshaped my understanding of the entire dynamic in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had spent years assuming Claire occupied a straightforwardly favored position in our mother's eyes, without fully considering that the good daughter designation carried its own specific weight and expectation, one that constrained Claire's life in ways just as real, if differently shaped, than the diminishment I'd been experiencing. We should have talked about this years ago, I told her. Both of us have apparently been quietly carrying resentment about the same underlying pattern without ever comparing notes directly. Part 9. Building something more honest. Over the following year, the relationship among the three of us, Claire, my mother, and me, gradually shifted into something more honest than what had existed before that difficult September phone call. My mother made a genuine, sustained effort to catch and correct the comparative language that had shaped so many of our interactions for years, occasionally still slipping into old patterns, but increasingly self-aware enough to notice and correct herself in real time, sometimes even apologizing mid-sentence when she caught herself starting down a familiar comparative path. Claire and I built a considerably more honest relationship with each other as well, moving past the unspoken assumption that our mother's favoritism operated in a simple, one-directional way, toward a shared understanding that both of us had been shaped, in different but equally real ways, by our mother's narrow framework for what counted as a good daughter. I brought Derek to the following Thanksgiving gathering, our relationship formally introduced to the extended family for the first time in the specific, deliberate way we'd chosen. As committed partners, without the marriage certificate my mother had spent years implying was the only legitimate marker of a serious relationship. My mother, notably, made a genuine effort to welcome him warmly, without the pointed comments about making things official that I'd braced myself to hear. Epilogue. It has been just over a year since that Tuesday afternoon in the grocery store parking lot, when my mother's offhand comment about Claire being the good daughter finally cracked open a conversation I'd spent over a decade avoiding. I think often about the specific mechanism of that particular moment, not a dramatic confrontation I'd planned or rehearsed, but a genuinely spontaneous response to a sentence I'd heard some variation of dozens of times before. One that happened, on that particular day, to land against 36 years of accumulated weight in exactly the way needed to finally break through years of careful, exhausted patience. My mother and I speak more honestly now than we have at any previous point in our adult relationship. It isn't perfect, old patterns occasionally resurface, and I suspect some version of that specific comparative instinct, learned, apparently, from her own mother decades earlier, will likely never fully disappear. But we have built, over the past year, a foundation considerably more honest than what existed before, one where I no longer feel obligated to silently absorb comparisons I'd spent over a decade cataloging without ever nomming directly. I think, too, about what I actually said that day, before hanging up, not dramatic, not cruel, simply, finally, true. I need you to actually hear what you just said. Sometimes, I've come to understand, the most significant thing you can say to someone who's hurt you for years isn't a grand confrontation or an ultimatum. It's simply, finally, nomming the pattern clearly enough that it can no longer hide behind the comfortable ambiguity of, I didn't mean it that way. Clearly enough that someone who genuinely loves you, however imperfectly, finally has no choice but to actually look at what they've been doing and decide for themselves whether they're willing to do the harder work of changing it. In the end,